Our next speaker is LIU Yang, who is head of the Department of Chinese South and Southeast Asian Art and curator of Chinese art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Dr. Liu also serves as a member of the advisory committee for the China Center at the University of Minnesota. Before moving to Minnesota, he served as a senior curator of Chinese art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. He was concurrently an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales. Since 1998, he's organized more than a dozen of traveling exhibitions from China and has published as many books on Chinese art and archaeology. 3 of his publications received awards from the Art Association of Australia and New Zealand for best catalogs. He is currently working on research, interpretation, publication, and exhibition of the MIA's outstanding collection of archaic Chinese bronzes. He was a contributing essayist to the Freer and Sackler Gallery's publication, Shipwrecked, Tang, Treasures, and Monsoon Winds. Please join me in welcoming LIU Yang, Dr. LIU Yang.
Thank you, Junie. I want to thank the Tang Center for inviting me to join this wonderful gathering, and also allowed me to revisit my research on this topic, which was done 16 years ago. I still remember the excitement the first time I saw some 35,000 bowls from this shipwreck that were housed in the warehouse in Nelson, New Zealand. That was a long time ago. Now, my topic today is the decorative motifs on Changsha bowls from the Belitung shipwreck. The excavation of the Belitung shipwreck is significant for the study of Changsha ware, as the ceramic cargo is dominated by bowls of some, as I mentioned earlier, 55,000 pieces manufactured in Changsha kilns. All those bowls are decorated in a wide range of freely painted designs in colorful underglaze, including vapors, clouds, or spirals, foliage, flowers, landscape, animals, and poems. Vapors, clouds, or spirals. In 733, a Tang poet, Meng Haoran, wrote the following lines when he wandered through the low hills of the Yunmeng marshes, gazing at the Dongting Lake, only a short distance to the north of Changsha. In the 8th moon, the lake is calm. The water and the sky blend into one. Vapors rise from the Yunmeng marshes, and the waves lap at LIU Yang's wall. Such was a description typical of the medieval poets who wrote about the scenery around the Dongting Lake, a region within the boundaries of the historical Chu state, whose climate was noted for its unusual natural phenomena. Vapor and cloud were common in this comparatively low-lying and well-watered terrain. The pervasiveness of the vapor and cloud motifs commonly seen in decorative arts arises not only from its natural quality, but also its cultural associations. From at least the 3rd century BC, the region was a destination for political exiles. Losers in factional struggles were sent from the court as a punishment. During the Tang, poets often spoke of the region as a place of melancholy, where the pervasive vapor appeared, dense and poison. It became a metaphor for the miserable future of displaced man. Such natural phenomena became the basis of a ubiquitous motif in the decoration of Changsha bowls, perhaps suffused with poetic overtones. The motif is striking for its unconventional form and for its evocative rhythm and movement. The frontally painted motif changes form constantly. At times it appears like steam rising from the valley, like this one. And at other time, it looks like a fleecy cloud floating by. There are two basic designs, a mushroom-like head and a spiral of different forms. Using these two principal forms, the Changsha craftsmen created numerous witty variations. First is a kind of a mushroom head with a long curving tail. And the second, a mushroom head upon a spiral. The third form, several mushroom-like clouds superimposed one upon another, forming a design resembling what Chinese call the lingzhi or fungus. And the number 4, combination of several mushroom-like heads and spirals. Whatever the variations, all are organic and living forms charged with energy, which are reminiscent of the pervasive yunqi or vapor motif seen on such pieces as the lacquerwares of the late Warring States period and the early Han, Western Han dynasty. In executing these decorations, one can visualize the rapid arm and brush movements of the artisans. Speed of execution certainly relies on individual artisan skill and personality, but in this case, the fluency was also inspired by motifs, and it was probably influenced by contemporary calligraphy, especially by so-called wild cursive style or script. This association is supported not only by the spontaneity and rhythm these calligraphy works possess, but also by the fact that Changsha was the home to a very famous calligrapher Huai Su, known as the Wild Monk, one of the most famous calligraphers in this cursive style. Calligraphy on the rediscovered Changsha bowls share the same style and the spirit as Huai Su's wild cursive script, as you can see this one, which was also from the Belitung Shipwreck. Foliage. On Changsha bowls, botanic motifs, particularly the foliage and the floral designs, take up by far the largest part of the decorative repertoire. Although there appear many variations ranging from simple patterns to more complex designs, the repertoire of compositional elements is not large. The basic motif is a cluster of foliage resembling radiating beams. This could well be stylized illustration of shrubs and trees. In some cases, however, the tips of the middle fern, In some cases, however, the tips of the middle fern plants curl to form a hook-like feature, resembling the tip of a young fern. The motif, therefore, looks more like the foliage of herbaceous plants. Complex groupings consisting of several clusters of foliage developed out of the original simple design, as illustrated by these 3 bowls. There's no doubt that the Changsha craftsmen derived their designs from actual plants. They draw on various types of shrubs and trees in decoration, as is evident in the extant examples from the shipwreck, like this one. However, most of the designs of the foliage motifs are stylized in such a way that they have been converted into fictional foliage. The motifs are essentially organic, but are executed with free brushwork, unconcerned with imitating nature. Again, the influence of contemporary calligraphy is felt when one looks at those designs. The foliage was painted with quick, decisive touches of a brush. The fluidity of brushwork reached a high standard only matched by the cursive style of the contemporary calligraphers. Floral patterns. On Changsha bowls, a few designs are naturalistic depiction of real flowers, but the majority of the floral patterns are highly stylized, recalling the decorative patterns prevailing for thousands of years in China. The most common stylized floral design is a discoidal form with 4, 5, 6 or more petals arranged like the downward perspective of a flower in full bloom. The Changsha potters seem to start with the simple pattern of 4 petals, but soon they fancifully added more petals and further embellished the whole design with all sorts of adornments. The areas between petals were supplemented with spirals, tendrils, or small petals. Starting with the simple rosette, more complicated designs were derived from grouping of more petals. In the most elaborate examples, a 4-petal rosette was embellished with spirals, petals, and other abstract elements, forming a design that looks like a rosette placed within a square, like this 2 illustrated. Some floral forms became highly abstract, although the movement of lines and arrangement elements are still reminiscent of treatment accorded with originally to the organic form. They have lost every invisible connection with the vegetal form. Here, abstract and geometric characteristics played a major part. Although the stylized floral rosette was one of the most popular patterns in Tang decorative art, a form that has its origin at least in the Warring State period in 4th to 3rd century. The abstracted floral rosette was really unique. They appear to have been first introduced by the artisans of the Changsha bowls. Landscape. By the 8th century, the interest of artists in China had begun to shift from man to nature. In an earlier period before the Tang dynasty, people comprised the main subject matter for art, and the landscape constituted no more than incidental background. Now it began to be depicted for its own sake. The flourishing of landscape painting as special genre during the Tang dynasty was reflected in the decoration of Changsha bowls. Several examples to attempt a realistic representation of nature scenery, as you can see in these 2 bowls, also from the Shipwreck. Although simply executed, mountain ranges in this picture were truthfully painted in fine outline without using texture strokes for modeling terrain and cliffs. Solitary trees grow from peaks and emerge from ravines, suggesting forested ranges. A few waving strokes on the foreground represent the water. It is interesting to see that the models that inspired the decoration of Changsha bowls were not certain well-known contemporary works, as you can see from this painting, attributed to 2 most well-known Tang dynasty painter of late 7th and early 8th century, or probably a copy of the late period of these 2 artists' work. But what we can see from the Changsha bowl, the landscape they painted, the model, rather earlier ones. The way that the trees are depicted larger than the hills is reminiscent of landscape painted by a very early artist such as Gu Kaizhi, the early 5th century painter. Changsha potters seems to be more interested in abstract mountains. In these stylized landscape compositions, the mountain contours were brushed in quick, decisive touches. The principal pattern was a mountain range rising and falling in the distance, featuring a central towering peak flanked by smaller ones. Vapors cloud gather around the mountain's peaks. Below the mountains are hidden in mists in the form of stylized scrolls. Such imagery is not only a reflection of natural phenomena, but also an echo of a long-standing tradition. Chinese have always looked on mountains as visible embodiment of mysterious natural forces. One of the most important powers attributed to the Great Mountain in China was their ability to produce mystery clouds. The 2nd century BC depictions on the coffins from Ma Wangdui, also from Changsha, vividly demonstrate such a belief. Although this form of landscape imagery had a naturalistic inspiration, in many examples the nature motifs were stylized or abstracted in such a way that the suggestion and the evocation replaced the direct description. Now, I have to just quickly mention that what Professor Mai had discussed, that many Chinese scholars had believed this kind of depiction is actually the Arabic phrase, meaning Allah is the greatest. But from what I showed in this previously, that they are apparently the abstract landscape rather than Arabic inscriptions. Fish and birds. A rare group of Changsha bows from the Tang wreck is interesting because of the use of a certain fish motif. These are not an ordinary species of fish. They appear to have grotesque heads and with large glaring eyes, wide-opened mouths, and sharp teeth. This creature was not unfamiliar to the people of the Tang dynasty. Its macra, a motif introduced from India. In the Indian myth, Makra is the vehicle of Varuna, the deity of the oceans. From 3rd century BC to 12th century, Makra was one of the popular decorative motifs in Indian art. The earliest mentioning of Makra in Chinese translation of Buddhist sutra dates back to the 4th century. It is interesting to note that the Chinese perception of Makra seems to emphasize its aggressive nature. In Chinese Buddhist texts dating from 5th to 9th century, the Makra was often referred as a fierce creature that destroyed ships, harmed voyagers, and engulfed everything. Such a belief is illustrated by a depiction on a bow from the Shipwreck, as some speakers had shown this before. It is apparent that popularity of the Makra image spread with the Buddhist doctrines. The association of the motif with Buddhism in the Tang dynasty is made clear by the adornments embellish the Makra on Changsha bows. Beside the patterns such as waves and clouds, a flaming centimony jewel is sometimes depicted as if the fish is chasing after it. The popularity that also showing the macro motifs depicted on other mediums of work, as you can see here in the silver plate with the gilt. The popularity of Buddhist belief in the region is also attested by frequent use of some other decorative motifs on Changsha bowls that associated with Buddhism. For instance, pagoda, and that one of the bowl, and the swastika. Despite its exotic flavor and the Buddhist association, perhaps the popularity of the macro motif was due to its grotesqueness, signifying a supernatural force with talismanic qualities. Among the animal motifs on the Changsha bowls, the bird occupies a predominant position. Although shown in variety of posture, the majority of birds decorated on the bowls from the Belitung shipwreck are seen flying. Although in some bowls bird motifs were painted solidly, the patterns of clouds, spirals, and foliage were added in many examples as background, suggesting that the birds were in mid-air. One of the most charming images of the bird is a depiction of its profile standing on one foot, while the other is raised, stretching forward. One other picture of the bird is unique because it depicts a peacock with the small bag with the long tassels holding its mouth. The image appears to be a vivid combination of realism and imagination. During the Tang Dynasty, flower and bird painting come to form a distinct school of art. The third major genre of painting in addition to landscape and figure painting. The development of flower and bird painting during this period provided a creative spur for decorative art. This popular trend is reflected in the decoration of the Changsha bowls. On the interior wall of one bowl, as shown here, details are uniquely incised and carefully organized into the composition. Two birds, each flying in a distinct pose, are attracted by a spray of flowers depicted in between them. Heavy clouds float below. The design is unique because, except those surviving in the tomb murals, very few Tang paintings in this subject have emerged to testify to the style championed by the imperial court and popular taste. This design, while still an earlier prototype in the flower and bird painting repertoire, exemplified the popularity of the genre during that time. There's a quite a similar example, also from the Shipwreck. Poems. The Tang Dynasty marked the golden age of Chinese poetry. During this time, poetry became more than a literary form, loved and not only for its enchantment, but also because it was a path to wealth and success. Because of the establishment of the civil service examination system, the ability to compose verse was now an absolute requirement for high office. The flourishing of poetry inspired Changsha craftsmen to turn poetry into a decorative medium. The most common form of poetry found on Changsha bowls was the 5-character form. This corresponds to the fashion of the time. The majority of poems seen on Changsha bowl seems to be folk songs. A fragment bowl from the Tang Shipwreck, showing here, bears a poem in the 5-character style. The poem is incomplete due to damage to the bowl. However, it is not difficult to reconstruct the poems on the basis of similar poems found elsewhere in Changsha. The poem may be translated, it's my only translation. Every day I pond over my journey ahead. Every morning I bid farewell to my master. Hiking amidst mountains and rivers, everywhere I hear birds twittering new songs. The sorrow of parting is expressed in one other poem written on the intact bow from the Tang Shipwreck. That reads, again my translation, how far is the southern sky in the eyes of a lone wild swan? The chilly wind strikes terror into one's heart. I miss my beloved who is traveling afar, beyond the great river, and my heart flies to the frontier morning and night. This piece is rather significant because the poem has never been seen before amongst some 80 to 90 distinct poems found to date on the Changsha ware. There are some poems expressing the joy of seasons and admiring nature. One unique example that is also unseen elsewhere reads, this year, this night is drawing to an end. The stride of the approaching year and the day can be heard. Gone with this night, the winter chill. Spring creeps in with the dawn. One other inscribed poem are viewable only partially. The spring ponds are full of spring rain. In spring, the spring grass sprouts. The incomplete poem again can be reconstructed in light of the same poem inscribed on an intact ewer excavated at Changsha and one other ewer in the Hunan Provincial Museum's collection. So it reads, again, my translation, the spring ponds are full of spring rain. In spring, the spring grass sprouts. Spring people gather to sip spring wine. Spring birds sing spring songs. In conclusion, the variety of motifs and the spontaneous brushwork secured important position these Changsha bowls in the history of Chinese decorative art. The ties of many motifs with the contemporary belief and aesthetics made them even more significant and charming. Thank you very much.